when we talk about representatives, we obviously talk about MPs in Parliament or congressmen and senators, if you're American, or whatever.
Representatives, yeah. We don't consider the Lords representative.
No. But say just the MPs, members of Parliament. So that's, if we're going to use it if we're actually going to use it, the term, in any real way in the present, we have to be aware that that's not what it was always used for, not at all. No. The idea, for example, like the king represents the nation in all things.
In a divine embodiment as well.
Well, in our modern sense, it's like, well, in what real way does he do that, though? Who is he representing? Because he can make his mind up, an absolute monarch anyway, can just make any decision he wants, in theory.
Yeah.
And so, well, he's not representing anyone other than his own conscience.
I suppose when they say representation in that manner, what they're really talking about is a kind of accumulation of power and legal authority in the king, right? So if you were a diplomat and you go and talk to the King of France, you're aware that technically the resources and powers of France can be brought to bear upon whatever it is the king wants to do. And so he can order an army to be raised or trade to be cut off or something like that, legal changes to be made. So he represents like the executive power of France, and I think that's what they mean in the sort of formalistic view.
So we'll get into it later when it's broken down in the main body of the book, but the idea that there's many different layers of representation that can be going on at once, right? So a king doesn't necessarily an absolute monarch in the 15th century, say, doesn't necessarily, doesn't
Louis
really,
XIV.
Let's say Louis XIV, doesn't represent the thoughts and feelings of the average French peasant.
No, but yet
he does still, at the same time, he does represent France in other ways, in symbolic ways.
Well,
right?
The abstract concept of France and the material that it can bring to bear on any given situation, he does in a way do represent. But the important part that Pitkin points out in the final chapter of this is that the claim of Parliament to represent the people was used as the justification and the weapon to overthrow the king and abolish the office.
Right.
So this is a really important political development in English history. It's an incredibly important word that has been used literally as the fulcrum around which revolutions flow, and yet we still don't have a very good understanding of this word. So it's no surprise that she felt the need to perform such a comprehensive study and go through it. So chapter 1 is just her introducing the scheme of the work, so we'll skip over that.
Don't you think, sorry Carl, just to say that, don't you think people do also a lot in our world today, talk past each other a lot about it? Everyone's using the same word and think they know what they mean and think we're largely all on the same page. And in fact, we're nearly all, not all, but lots of different groups of people are walking around with very different definitions in their head of what they mean.
It's almost like it's deliberate.
Well, yeah, well.
We know that the left wing are definitely deliberately bastardizing words. But one word they actually don't really bastardize is actually representation, because they never go to any length of effort to define it.
It's better and easier for them, I imagine, to leave it vague.
Absolutely.
Because then they can use it.
They can keep moving the goalposts.
Right. Yeah. And that's their favourite trick, isn't it?
Yes. So, and this is why I thought this was so important. So, Pitkin begins in chapter 2 with the problem of Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes, of course, being an absolute monarchist who wrote during the period of the English Civil War, witnessed all of the tremendous hardship and suffering of it, and came to the conclusion that actually an absolute monarch was necessary and desirable to prevent man from degenerating into the state of nature where he is living an existence that is nasty, brutish, and short, and therefore this gives the king absolute representative power over the entire nation. Now, Hobbes recognized two aspects to this kind of authority: the right to perform an action, from which rights and privileges accrue, and the responsibility for the action, to which obligation and responsibilities also accrue. And so the sovereign is the total representative of the entire incorporated body of the nation. And for Hobbes, rationality was the key part of this. Of course, a dog or a cat couldn't be represented because they couldn't understand themselves as being represented.
I mean, it's interesting. It's important to note, isn't it, that of course there's no element of democracy here. A king isn't. You don't vote for a king.
No, this is
he was born to represent the whole nation
completely. This is pre-democracy,
and so it's very sort of 17th century, isn't it? To have this view.
Yes.
Okay. And I just wanted to say that explicitly.
No. That's a good point. Like, democracy isn't even on the table here.
Right.
We're not talking about democracy. What we're talking about is a kind of, and again, I don't want to keep saying religious, but I can't think of a better term, because it is kind of a pseudo-religious political view of how the monarch, in one sense, actively and symbolically embodies what the nation state is.
Yeah.
Because Hobbes is using he's one of the original sort of social contract theorists, which is starting to gain traction around this time. And in fact, Leviathan is a document in which he expands his view on the social contract, which is to keep us out of the state of nature.
We will get to Rousseau, won't we? Of course. But I think Rousseau and Hobbes, well, they do definitely disagree about representation.
Yeah.
I think fairly profoundly. But I just wanted to say I did at my postgrad, I did a module on political philosophy and did an essay on representation. I remember being in my sort of mid-20s and reading sort of chronologically, like we're going to go through this, and reading each one and thinking, oh yeah, that's good, that makes sense, I like that, I'll go along with that, that's what I think now.
Yeah.
And then you read the next one, you're like, no, that's better, that's a better definition, that's what I think now. And sometimes you have that in your intellectual journey.
Yeah.
And each one seems to be more convincing than the last.
Yeah.
So I remember thinking, I don't know how anyone could disagree with John Stuart Mill or something. That's perfect. They've got it now. There's nothing more to understand. And then you realise, oh, actually, that is actually deficient in all sorts of ways. But I think Hobbes in the 17th century would have, if you lived in a world where it was kind of, maybe not absolute monarchies, but monarchies were just
totally
de rigueur, you know.
It's just normalcy.
Right, yeah, exactly. You would have just gone along with his definitions, I imagine.
Oh, yeah, and Hobbes was a very smart chap as well.
First half of the 17th century, anyway. Yeah, of course.
I mean, you wouldn't... But this is another thing that I think we need to have a talk about at some point, just to explain to people, because there's this post-Enlightenment sort of conceit that ideas are timeless and placeless. And that's just not true. No. Ideas come from a particular time and place due to the pressures on the people. And this is precisely what we see in Hobbes. His view of the state of nature and the social contract are a product of the English Civil War that he doesn't want to see repeated. If it wasn't for these pressures, he probably wouldn't think like this. And so it's one of those things that we've got to get out of the habit of saying, well, this is an idea for all times and all places. Like, there's no such thing.
Yeah.
And there never has been such a thing. And we shouldn't, again, it's a conceit that we think that we could have an idea for all times and all places. It's nonsense.
Yeah, it's very low resolution, isn't it? That someone's mastered all of politics, all of political
ideas,
philosophy. Yeah, it's the end of the history of philosophy or something.
Francis Fukuyama is a bit arrogant in that way. But the point Pitkin makes is that the social contract, Hobbes essentially uses it as a kind of trap to get us into this particular view of representation. But the problem that she finds with Hobbes, and I think this is totally fair, is that there are no limits or demands placed on the person doing the representing. And this was, of course, the problem of the absolute monarch. If you are given phenomenal amounts of power and you are told, right, you are the symbol and executor, representative of the entire nation, why shouldn't they have some sort of claim on what you do?
Right. It seems completely reasonable. Or it's the first step.
Yeah.
Right. Into the modern mind.
Yes.
Like, of course, that's reasonable.
Yes. It's totally reasonable.
I can imagine that someone like Louis XIV, the Sun King, the classic example of an absolute monarch,
I am
would
the
have
state.
Yeah.
Famously.
Yeah. Like, my word is law. Whatever I say now.
Yeah.
Whatever comes out of my mouth.
I mean, it's the divine right of
law.
Kings.
Right.
God has made it. I am his representative on earth. I am the embodiment of the nation. From what position do you dare argue?
So I think he would, even that first sort of step, that first rung on the ladder of trying to put checks and balances on a monarch's claim to represent an entire nation of people, he would reject even that. I think, well, we would have done.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
And this is, exactly Hobbes's position. This is why he's an absolute monarchist. But of course, Pitkin, and I think reasonably, says this view of representation, there is something to it. The head of state is in some way representative of the country. I mean, you see, Kim Jong-un, he does in some way represent North Korea, but not in a way we would consider to be substantive or useful, because there are no prescriptions on what he ought to do. And so the problem of Hobbes, she says, is the problem of the creation of political consensus, the peaceful settlement of disputes and the development of the community. Representation, in her view, of course, plays some important part of this, and that's why she's embarking on this study. It's like, how can we suggest that we understand this? And so she breaks down representation into 4 different chapters to get a better understanding of it. The third chapter is the first one of these, which is the formalistic views of representation. So Hobbes falls firmly into a formalistic view of representation. And she breaks this further down into the authorization view and the accountability view. Now, I'm going to skip over the fine granular detail of the authorization view. But what this basically means is the sovereign is essentially authorized to do anything that he wants because he represents the state and everything in it. This is one way of looking at it, the Hobbesian way of looking at it, and a few others. But again, I'm just going to skip over those for now just for time. But this means that there's no option for democracy. There's no option for the people to object. And so if their needs are going unmet, well, so what? God ordained this.
Right.
You've got no position from which to argue. And so the other alternative view in the formalistic conception, and in fact, before I go on, the reason that she personally rejects the sort of Hobbesian formalistic view is it can't really explain why the word represent can be used in ways that are not formulated in terms of agreements, rights, and obligations. So we use the term represent to mean lots of different things in lots of different contexts. And if it's just that the formalistic view of representation explains what representation is, well, how do you explain these other contexts? And of course, you can't.
So, for example, an actor represents a character on stage.
Represents Julius Caesar in a play.
Right.
There's nothing to do with agreements, rights, and obligations.
Right.
You know, that's a much more literal representing of something that is absent, you know?
Well, if you've got a boss and he sends you off to do a job on his behalf, you're sort of representing him, or you're representing the company or something.
Absolutely, you're an agent in some way, which is a form of representation. The other view in the formal views is the accountability view, which holds that a representative is someone who is to be held to account, which is the diametric opposite of the authorization view. But of course, this has problems as well. It's like, okay, well, if it's someone to be held to account, why? And in what way?
Yeah, and how are you going to do that?
Yeah, and what have they been doing?
Right.
You know, why? Well, you're there to be held to account. Okay, but what did you elect me for? To hold you to account? Yeah, but for what? You know, am I meant to make the sky green? You know, am I meant to pass legislation? Am I meant to go bake cookies? What are you holding me to account for? There's no instructive prescription.
And who among you can hold me to account?
Exactly, on what
and
grounds?
on what criteria?
Yeah.
All sorts of things. But I think the accountability view is our modern, at least part of it, that plays, you start getting sort of the modern idea, you know, 21st century MPs and congressmen and women and things.
Yeah.
We want them to be accountable.
Yeah, absolutely.
Don't we? So we would sort of reject, not entirely because it's sort of a mixture of all different ideas, but mostly we sort of need them to be accountable. Well, mostly, almost entirely. Or that's my opinion.
Well, and it's a perfectly common opinion. Pitkin points out that the concept of representation, the way it's used is kind of like shards of meaning, and so there are shards of truth in this. We do accept that the person in charge, it doesn't have to be a monarch, just whoever's in charge, and however they got there, there is a kind of authorization view where they are authorized by the political community above which they rule to act in its name. That is true. But Hobbes's position is a bit monodimensional, saying, well, okay, well, that's it. That's all we needed to know. The accountability view is what's missing from that position, basically. So, yeah, okay, they are authorized to act, but also they are accountable to the people who put them where they are. You know, and that's how we ended up with a sort of constitutional monarchy. You know, that's the checks and balances. And so that's the diametric opposite, but they're not, it's not appropriate to think of them as unique, separate things that never touch. Actually, they're just two halves of the same sort of coin, two sides of the same coin, you know?
Right, so a representative is no longer just simply that, a representative floating in space, but they've actually got a relationship with the people that they're representing.
Yes.
And again, I think to the modern mind, it's like, duh, obviously, yes, what are we talking about? What
but
are we doing
to the 17th century mind.
Okay. That was an important distinction to have to make.
Yeah, you
right?
didn't vote, so
Yeah.
who do you think you are? You're upending the divine order of the cosmos, you arrogant pleb.
Right, yeah.
You know?
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.